it becomes a little bit too easy in our field to think, okay, we have data, there's a new algorithm out there, I'm going to apply the new algorithm to this data, I'll detect something new and I'll publish a paper about it. And one thing that I think is really nice to see is that over the past couple of years, there is more awareness about these concerns, such as helicopter research and other ethical concerns that come along with the use of artificial intelligence algorithms.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Tumampos, and you're listening to Down to Earth, the show where we talk to incredible geoscientists about their science and its impacts on our planet. This season, we've been exploring the many ways we can harness artificial intelligence to learn more about our world. I've also been in a personal quest to discover if AI will be more of a help or more of a hindrance to our work as geoscientists. From rapid disaster response to streamlined workflows, AI offers incredible opportunities that save lives and maximize resources. Additionally, AI can optimize workflows, automating tasks, and freeing geoscientists to focus on high-impact research. However, challenges continue to persist. For example, data quality issues can lead to inaccurate results, and limited accessibility to supercomputers makes it difficult for all researchers to access AI capabilities. As I've delved deeper into my AI journey this season, I've realized that AI is neither good nor bad for geoscience. It's both. AI can streamline processes and react quickly to emerging situations, but it can also incorporate biases, produce incorrect results, and consume significant environmental resources. To maximize the benefits and mitigate the risks, scientists must be aware of these opportunities and challenges. That's where ethics in AI comes in. Today, we're speaking with an incredible researcher dedicated to ensuring AI systems remain ethical and responsible. Let's get started. This episode of Down to Earth is brought to you by the Geoscience and Remote Sensing Society's technical committees. As part of the world's leading professional association for the advancement of technology, the GRSS technical committees are innovation hubs, bringing together experts from around the world to forward cutting-edge geoscience research, development, and applications. To learn more and be part of the premier community driving the future of geoscience and remote sensing, visit grss-ieee.org and join a technical committee today.
A couple of years ago, we saw a lot of attention first coming out to how powerful deep learning models are and how much AI is really changing how we work. And it's for many different fields using imagery, but also for geospatial applications. And then we also see in society that there are a lot of ethical concerns, and ethics can be very broad, but there was a lot of concerns about the possible biases in different applications and things like that. And I figured, okay, if we are using similar models in geospatial applications, what does that mean for our field? Because if they are biased and if they are difficult to explain in other fields, which is gaining a lot of media attention, then in our work in geospatial sciences and remote sensing, we must be facing similar issues.
This is Dr. Carolyn Gevaert, Associate Professor in Geoinformatics at University of Twente and a consultant for the World Bank. Carolyn's research focuses on the use of geospatial technologies like drones, satellites, and GeoAI for sustainable development in middle-income countries. Through her research, she attempts to develop automatic processes for identifying and classifying objects and images for on-the-ground decisions about invasive species, disaster relief, and more. With the growing public concerns about AI use, Carolyn has started to take a deeper look at the ethical issues surrounding the technology she uses.
I really started getting involved in this ethical component, I would say about 5 years ago now. And a lot of my reasons for moving towards the ethics part is not because I consider myself to be the most ethical or something like that, but really out of a concern of like, okay, how are we doing research? And through my connections or my work at the World Bank and for other end users to say like, okay, what are we doing?
In particular, Carolyn focuses on fairness, which entails ensuring that algorithms are fair and, to the extent possible, unbiased in AI workflows. As we know, AI is a complex and often black box tool, so Carolyn's work is not exactly easy. But she's advancing several projects where ethics are at the core of the work, and she's got lots to share with us about how we can do the same. Let's dive in. I always like to begin these interviews with definitions and context. So could we please start with your definition of GeoAI?
GeoAI for me is in using different artificial intelligence algorithms. So in particular, we get a lot from the field of computer vision to interpret geospatial data.
Okay. And what are some of the ethical challenges we encounter with GeoAI?
There are many different answers to this. I usually look at frameworks of, first of all, what is ethical? It comes down to different sets of values that we are trying to maintain. So there are lots of different frameworks out there, what is important, what is not important. It's also very culturally dependent. We did some interesting work with the ISCE working group some years ago that we are also working with different people all over the world, because you see that also what is considered ethical in one country is kind of different from other countries because they have different values. My own work focuses mainly on fairness. So how can we make sure that algorithms are fair, which I very closely relate to biases, to understand what kind of biases are present in the algorithm and what kind of biases are we propagating if we are actually using AI workflows for such sustainable development topics or disaster risk management topics. I'm also looking at explainability. So if we are looking at the use of an AI workflow, how can we explain the results? We are also working on a project on accountability and to see how these values come together to make it more accountable. So there are many different ethical values, and of course it's very challenging to look at all of them. But essentially it's at selecting a couple and seeing what you as a researcher can focus on. And for now, I focused it on the ones that I mentioned.
Let's get into some examples that illustrate these ethical challenges like fairness and explainability, and also you mentioned accountability. You've recently been investigating the ethics surrounding the use of drones for sustainable development work with a case study in Malawi. Tell us about this research.
Yeah. So this work is part of a project with the social scientists at the University of Twente. There's a philosopher, Associate Professor Michael Malkenborg, who's involved, and also a PhD student and a postdoc, and another professor in the urban planning department. And essentially, what we are looking at here is the use of drones for humanitarian aid. So we're working together with 510, an initiative of the Netherlands Red Cross, and UNICEF Malawi, or now also East Africa, are involved. And essentially, it's thinking that if we start using drones and GeoAI in these contexts of flood response, so that there is just a flood and you want to distribute aid to the people living in an area, you might be looking at drone imagery to estimate how many buildings there were before the flooding, so potentially how much damage there is, how much aid needs to be distributed. And then some of the questions on involving ethics are, especially if you use automated workflows, how accurate are these automated workflows? Are there any biases, like the biases that I mentioned? Because what you definitely don't want to happen is imagine that you are distributing aid and you're using the results of an AI algorithm, which is then biased, that it doesn't recognize certain groups as much as others. So especially if you're talking about vulnerable groups, what you definitely don't want to happen as a humanitarian worker is to be giving less aid or underestimating the needs of people in certain groups because of such biases in algorithms. And also we found that there are some other ethical concerns. So if you think of privacy, people often think of privacy as a concern when they think of personally identifiable information. So can you see me as a person? Can you recognize me as a person in drone imagery? But we often have in geospatial data is a problem of group privacy. So sometimes you can identify certain types of groups or certain group characteristics without identifying individual persons. Being identified as part of a group can have consequences on the way that a person is treated, even though it is about information about the group and not about the individual. So when we think of geospatial data, there are a lot of concerns about this group privacy, which is relatively new. And there are issues such as, for example, the mosaicing effect, because in geospatial data, because everything has coordinates, it's very easy to overlay different types of layers into one place. So actually combining different sources of information, you create new information, which can potentially be harmful for certain people. Another big issue is open data. So this can be a very tricky question because a lot of development agencies and humanitarian workers want to use more and more open data. And also as universities, we are really promoting the use of open data because you know that it can be beneficial and reused in so many different ways. And data collected once can have so many different benefits. But then we sometimes face problems that also you don't know how the data might potentially be misused. So what does this mean from a privacy point of view? What does this mean with the mosaicing effect? How can the data be misused for different reasons? These are all kind of concerns that we often have as researchers, but also as people working in the field.
Okay, wow, that's a lot of challenges. So you mentioned biases in workflows and then privacy, not just in terms of identifying individuals, but also in terms of group privacy, which is something I've never thought about before. It makes a lot of sense that the group characteristics of a community seen from space can really impact how both groups and individuals are treated. And then you also mentioned the mosaicing effect, where by layering multiple different types of information, we can create new information, which may or may not be beneficial or accurate. And finally, your point about open data is a really important one too, especially when it comes to data hungry AI algorithms. This concept of open data is appealing, but there are certainly concerns with how the data might get treated and used. So, can you give an example of why open data might actually present some ethical challenges?
Yeah. So hypothetically speaking, imagine that you are responsible for mapping the buildings for a flood exposure. So you want to understand what the flood risk would be and which areas of the city are more risky for floods, or which buildings might be damaged if there is a flood. And at the same time, let's say the buildings are not vulnerable, but the people living in them might be more poor and not have as many social resources. And then at the same time, they're located in an area that they might not be allowed to be living in. So if you publish this data as open data, what happens? What are really the consequences to the people in these cities or in these areas? And that is always a very tricky question with the type of work that we are doing, and often one that's very difficult to answer.
Yeah, that's definitely tricky. So, how are other researchers responding to all these ethical concerns?
Well, researchers like me are perhaps saying like, hey, this is something new. This is something we need to pay attention to. In all of these types of questions, what's really, really important is really communication with the people on the ground. That is something that we, as researchers, really need to take into account. And I think it's especially tempting with a field like remote sensing, because, we have the image and we think, oh yeah, we can see what's in the image. If I have a drone image, I can see that that's a building. But I mean, sometimes on the ground, it's really, there's so much contextual knowledge that we don't understand, and judgments that we are making that we don't understand if you are so far from the local context. And also when we talk about possible consequences of data being shared. So it's always very important as a researcher to be very closely involved with people on the ground who have a lot of knowledge about the local context.
That's a really great point, and I agree. Local context would be beneficial. Can you give an example to illustrate how local context can change our research work? Like, what changes would local context make to our research question or design, or possibly how we interpret results?
So in reviewing the data, it's always really amazing how much local knowledge there is. Like I remember sitting with a student of mine who was from Rwanda, and we were looking at the journal data that I had collected, and he looks at a building and he's like, this is a commercial building. I'm like, what? How can you see that? And then he said, yeah, you can see that there's a roof and then there's a little area in front. So they had kind of a porch in front, and then that meant that there was a shop. And I'm just looking at a building roof. It's like, man, I would have no idea, So it's really things like that. Or there they had then water collection points where there were very typical like yellow plastic jars that people were going, or like, what's it called? I don't know, like these plastic containers that were yellow that people were going to collect. So if you saw a building roof and all these different kind of like yellow jugs around, then I thought, hey, this is probably a water collection point. But I mean, me living in the Netherlands, I would never know that if I don't have the local knowledge. So it's always amazing when sitting with different people, how much they know about the field and how much they know about the community, and you always learn something. Another funny thing is often in using the results, it can be somehow frustrating sometimes, because even though AI is getting much better, I think it's not always at the level that it can be used for some use cases. So one question is, how much accuracy is enough? I mean, if you get like an 85% accuracy, you're like, oh, okay, it's kind of decent. Maybe you push it up to 90, maybe a bit over 90. But even if you have a 90% accuracy, you're still getting 1 in 10 buildings wrong. And from a user point of view, you can see that often looking at the results, if they see a couple of errors or also like very silly errors that the human would not make, then automatically the trust goes down a little bit. So it's always very interesting to have a very honest conversation also with the end users, to be very critical on how can these workflows actually be used.
In your view, is the AI tech developing too quickly to address issues like the accuracy issue you mentioned? Is there a way to incorporate local knowledge into AI algorithms and training to improve accuracy?
That there is definitely ways of including local knowledge. It's on the one hand, talking with people, also working with local data collection. With the World Bank, I was involved in a project called Digital Public Works, where during COVID, because we could not go and collect data, we were also working on connecting to people through different smartphone applications to collect data locally and to use those to train or to validate algorithms that were developed from abroad. But in the end, that is one way, but also really just being conscious about connecting with different people.
Right. And also, I understand that it has been difficult so far, right? I keep thinking that maybe we should build an in situ policy for geo AI work, but instead of just measuring the land, we incorporate the cultural interpretation of the content too.
Yeah, and the good thing is I'm a bit optimistic that this is kind of that there is more awareness for this. So also, if you look, I think especially you see big influence from the US as well, that you see a lot of funding from private institutions for collecting data in data scarce regions. So I think there is some attention for this, which is very good if we can kind of ride that wave and incorporate it more closely in both, if you see the funding mechanisms, so really in putting dedicated funding to help support these initiatives, and then also trying to reflect as researchers what we can do ourselves to contribute to this.
It really all comes down to the funding.
Yes and no. I think the bigger scale, of course, it's easier if it really comes down to data collection and funding. And of course, if you have a lot of money to collect a huge data set where you can really go to the field and spend time interviewing thousands of people, that's better. But that doesn't mean that we don't have a personal responsibility when we are going and conducting our own research. And especially in this accountability of being honest of what a model does and doesn't do, sometimes selecting the research questions, and like I said, even like how we are interacting when we are doing fieldwork ourselves, and like these issues of helicopter research. There are some things that we can do in ourselves as well in the way that we are conducting our research.
Coming up, Carolyn shares some suggestions for how we can build more ethical practices into our workflows. We also dig into the role of standardization in ethical AI. And finally, I ask her what she thinks about AI being more of a help or more of a hindrance given all these ethical concerns. All this right after the break.
Want to be at the forefront of geoscience and remote sensing innovation? Then join one of the Geoscience and Remote Sensing Society's technical committees. With 8 committees to choose from, you'll find your niche. From earth science, informatics to data fusion and climate technologies, our committees are driving progress and advancing the state of the art in geoscience remote sensing work. Through our networks, you'll collaborate with global professionals, participate in cutting-edge research, and apply innovations to real-world challenges. Enhance your career, expand your network, and contribute to a better tomorrow. Visit grss-ieee.org and join a technical committee today.
Welcome back. Today we're talking about ethics in GeoAI with Dr. Carolyn Gevaert, Associate Professor in Geoinformatics at University of Twente and a consultant for the World Bank. So far, the conversation has been really rich, diving into several real-world examples where the ethical decisions aren't as clear-cut as they might be in a lab scenario. The conversation has made me eager to learn how scientists like myself can actually build more ethical practices into our projects from the start. Here's what Carolyn suggests. Carolyn, earlier in our conversation, you mentioned the importance of local knowledge. And I think local knowledge plays a key role in helping us mitigate ethical issues in our projects. So how can we make sure communities can support and have a say in our work?
So ideally, these communities and other stakeholders should be involved in defining the research question, because sometimes the most interesting research questions are also not what we come up with as scientists, but also really connecting with people on the ground and understanding that the research and the results would really be useful for people on the ground. So essentially, the connection starts before the research question is defined. And then I think one thing is to just throw yourself in there. So really going on fieldwork, and when being on fieldwork, talking with as many different people as possible to get different perspectives, because it's often very subtle. So like really looking at your data together with other people who are supposed to be using your end products, let's say, or what you are trying to develop, because they will always see things that you had never imagined that you would see before. And then also being very conscious about how you are conducting the research, like what information is actually staying on the ground. And okay, we're going to publish an article, but out of the community members that you interviewed, how many people are actually going to read a publication in a journal online? So while doing research, it's also just working together to not only improve the quality of the research, but really to share knowledge while you are doing it and to involve people more closely and to think of how you can make the results useful to them afterwards.
Good point. So how do we make sure end users are participants right through to the end of the project, especially in terms of understanding the results?
Yeah, so specifically, so about understanding the outputs, maybe it's about understanding how the outputs were made. So what it means in AI, what the strengths and weaknesses are of AI. Part of it is trying to raise awareness of what good practices are. Another thing is trying to be very clear. And I think this is also really where the accountability of people like us, like researchers or people working in the field who are really developing these algorithms or using algorithms to generate new data, the accountability on our side. So to really be honest and not trying to oversell, because you see a lot of geospatial technologies, sometimes they're a little bit oversold, but really if we are honest about what the strengths are, but also the weaknesses, then we can also help find the sweet spot of where it can be used and where it should not be used. And I think that's really important. So you see in the community for accountable and transparent AI, which is still quite new for the geospatial domain, but there was a very famous paper which was talking about model cards. And now also on the Hugging Face platforms that is implemented, where they really have, for example, a specific section on biases. So the idea is that you make a card for every model that you publish, and you should be very careful to explain what kind of training data was used, so where you would expect the model to generalize or not to generalize, how it was evaluated, what kind of biases you would expect. So also given the type of training data you had or how the model was done, like what are really the known weaknesses or the expected weaknesses of the model, so that a user wanting to use your model or to replicate it has a bit of a better idea of what the potential strengths and weaknesses could be, or like what to watch out for.
That's very interesting. It feels like we're still in the very early stages of understanding how to navigate the ethical issues in geo AI. Like we identify an issue, address it, and another pops up.
Yeah, and I mean, some of them are new and some of them are old in a way. So a lot of the ethical issues are related to the increased use of AI. But some of them were also around before that, right? I mean, if you think back to our classes when we were studying remote sensing, I guess you also had that. And then we were talking about sampling strategies, right? Or, for example, if you have unbalanced classes, you should not use the overall accuracy as a reporting metric. These types of things. So like some of these issues are also kind of propagating now, though also new ones are emerging as we are dealing with new technologies. Or, for example, the use of drone imagery will be different from the use of satellite imagery simply because of the increased resolution. So some questions are new, some questions are old, and it's also very important to try tackling these questions with really interdisciplinary team of scientists.
Yeah, very true. One thing I'm curious about actually is standardization. Is standardization being used to improve the ethics of AI, or how does that work? I'm just curious because, labeling buildings as part of a slum, for example, is also an ethical issue, right?
Yeah. No, yeah, definitely. I mean, those are also kind of the questions. And that's why you asked in the beginning, like, okay, what is ethical? It's so broad. What you can try to do is make like checklists. Like, okay, these are in general considered good practices. But at the same time, each situation, each project, each situation is so different because there are always different things locally or that contextualize it, that also mean that as soon as you make a checklist, it's automatically also not going to be perfect. It's always a funny conversation between more technical people who are like, okay, give me what a value to optimize for and I can implement it. How do you define fairness and I'll make optimization function that matches it? Whereas then a social scientist who says, yeah, okay, well, it depends on many different ways to, balance different values. So what I said before is that fairness is sometimes defined by looking at the different accuracy metrics and trying to balance them across the different subgroups. But so the funny thing is that when you try balancing them, there are so many different, what are you going to balance? Are you going to balance the false negative rate or the false positive rate? You cannot balance all of the accuracy metrics at the same time. So then it's often in discussion with different stakeholders and thinking about specific, so in this context, what do we want? What is more important to balance? So if we are thinking of, for example, in humanitarian aid, you might say like, okay, a false negative maybe is more important than a false positive. Because if you think that there are two buildings instead of one, maybe you're giving more aid to an area, whereas if you miss a building, then you're administering less aid to a certain area. So, this is, again, very generalized, but just to give an idea of that according to different applications, you might also be balancing different fairness metrics. So that is always kind of tricky, and that in a way, once something is defined, it becomes a bit easier to integrate into an algorithm, but then defining this thing and then applying it to another context can still be very tricky.
Yeah, definitely. Now, two areas we haven't fully touched on yet are bias and explainability. So can you talk a bit about how we're dealing with issues of bias and explainability in GeoAI? Let's start with defining explainability and go from there.
So when you are developing a model, explainability can help you understand whether the model is performing well or not and what you can do to improve the model. And it's also used to explain how well models might perform in other places. If you take a model that was trained in one location and you want to understand how well it generalizes to a different location, elements of explainability can help you understand how well it's being transferred to another place, and also for some cases to control.
Great, thanks. And how are we dealing with issues of bias and explainability in GeoAI? Maybe you can use some examples from your project, Bridging the Gap Between Artificial Intelligence and Society.
Yeah, so this is a personal research grant that I wrote. And what really initiated this with me is I was looking at some building outline data sets that were released by a large software company many years ago. And when looking at them visually, it looked like they were missing the buildings in informal areas. So I was looking at the city in Africa, and I could see that the richer areas of the city where the buildings were mapped better. But if you really looked at the poorer community, so the poorer areas of the city, the buildings were not recognized. And I thought, man, if we are systematically missing the people who need it most, this is a huge issue. So that's why one of the things I decided to look into is biases. And this was a little bit tricky. I think what the difficult part is of biases is the funny thing is that from a mathematical point of view, actually, it's not that difficult. Biases come up, and the way to assess for biases is like you can just compare the accuracies of different groups. Like, okay, are the accuracies the same for different groups, and the model is not biased? And then maybe if you see that the accuracy for one group is much lower than for the other groups, then you could say the model is biased against that group. What's especially tricky when looking for geospatial data is that models are always biased. But what we are concerned about is when the biases are related to certain socioeconomic characteristics. And then it often goes down to different frameworks against discrimination. And when looking at geospatial data, for example, again, coming back to the building outlines, you can recognize informal areas because of the pattern of the buildings. So when looking at it, you can say, okay, it's an informal area. But of course, the building outline itself doesn't have any data on this is an informal area or this is a poorer neighborhood. So you need to find auxiliary data sets to try to estimate this. And I think that is also one challenge, that I think in implementing a workflow to audit for biases, the methods are getting there, but I think the real challenge is finding the auxiliary data sets in order to audit the biases properly. Then the explainability point of view is how can we communicate the explainability of algorithms? And what's interesting is that you often see that in our domain, we often look at explainability as really only explainability of the algorithm itself, whereas explainability in many other perspectives is also explainability of the entire workflow. So not only the model, but also like the outputs and how can it be used and how can it not be used. So it's also important in our field, to look a bit broader, I think, and to be a bit more critical. So also looking at the methods of explainable AI being developed. Again, it's sometimes just a researcher making a explainable AI model and publishing papers saying, okay, this is how I added an explanation to my model. And there are actually very, very few papers that go one step further and try to test the explainability method with different end users or using certain qualitative or quantitative metrics to say like, okay, it's not just here's an explanation and have fun, but really to critically think like, does this explanation actually help somebody understand what's going on?
Right. This season, Caroline, we've been exploring whether or not AI will be more of a help or a hindrance in geoscience work. What are your thoughts on this, especially given your work in AI and ethics?
I mean, my idea is that it's definitely going to help. I think we need to be very critical about where it helps and where it doesn't. The important thing is a mix of, on the one hand, having good guidelines and best practices in place, but also as researchers just kind of reflecting on what we are doing and why we are doing it and reaching out to the end users that we are targeting to really communicate with them and make sure we're staying on track.
And what do you see for the future of AI in EO?
AI is already revolutionizing EO. I think it's going to help solve some of the relatively simpler questions that perhaps we are asking now, so that we can start asking more difficult research questions. And I think at one point we're also going to switch towards using the AI to actually learn more about what we are seeing.
I believe we're in an era where our work should not only advance science, but also contribute to society. As scientists, it's essential to shift our mindset and actions. Our research must create a positive impact, not just on the environment, but also in society. This calls for a reevaluation of the scientific method, one that integrates ethics and inclusivity at its core. And this is why I think that anytime we choose to use AI, we need to be mindful about how, why, and for whom we're using it. By doing this, we can create an atmosphere of responsibility and purpose, which I believe will enable AI to be used as a tool for positive change in societal well-being, all while addressing the challenges our Earth is facing. What do you think? Let us know in the comments for this episode. Learn more about Dr. Caroline Gevaert and her work by visiting her research page at the University of Twente. And be sure to follow us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, where you can check out episodes from seasons 1 to 5. By following us, you'll also be updated on any future seasons of the podcast. Finally, send some love to our sponsors at IEEE_GRSS on X and Instagram, and IEEE Geoscience and Remote Sensing on Facebook and LinkedIn. This episode was produced by Nicole Bedford from Nicole Bedford Films, with help from me, Stephanie Tumampos. Graphics and design by Mylene Briggs of Kila Media. And a special thanks to Manil Maski and Fabio Pacifici for their support. I'm Stephanie Tumampos, and you've been listening to Down to Earth.